My teacher said I'd never amount to anything until the day I saved her daughter's life. Mrs. Delacroix told me I was wasting space in her classroom during junior year chemistry. Not quietly, not privately, but in front of 30 students while handing back our midterm exams. She dropped mine on the desk with a D circled so hard the pen had torn through the paper. She said boys like me were why she questioned her career choice, that I clearly didn't have the discipline or intellectual rigor for advanced sciences, that perhaps I should consider trade school instead of pretending I belonged in college prep. I was 17 and already working 40 hours a week at my uncle's auto shop to help my mom pay rent. I'd studied for that exam until 2 a.m. for 3 nights straight, oil still under my fingernails from the day shift, coffee keeping me awake through practice problems. The D felt like a knife. Her words felt like she was twisting it. The thing about Mrs. Delacroix was that she had her favorites and she had her targets. The favorites were kids like Preston Whitmore, whose father owned half the commercial real estate in town, or Sienna Patel, whose mother was a state senator. These kids got extended deadlines and grade curves and patient explanations when they struggled. Then there were targets like me, kids who showed up in Dickies work pants because we came straight from jobs, kids who sometimes fell asleep in class because we'd closed the shop at midnight and opened at 6 a.m., kids whose moms cleaned houses for a living and whose dads weren't in the picture. Mrs. Delacroix had decided on day one which category I belonged in, and nothing I did would change her mind. She'd look at me like I was tracking mud across her clean floors, just by existing in her classroom. My mom had worked as a housekeeper for 20 years, cleaning the homes of people who looked through her like she was furniture. We lived in a 2-bedroom apartment in the south end of town, the side where the grocery store had bars on the windows and the bus stopped running after 9 p.m. My mom had gotten pregnant with me at 16, and my father had left before I was born. She dropped out of high school to work, sacrificing everything so I could have what she didn't. Every time I brought home a good grade, she'd cry and say I was going to be the first person in our family to go to college. Every time I brought home a bad grade, she'd blame herself, saying she should have been able to afford a tutor. The pressure was crushing. I needed to succeed for both of us. Mrs. Delacroix seemed determined to ensure I failed. The pattern started small. She'd mark my lab reports with excessive red ink, circling minor errors while ignoring identical mistakes in Preston's work. She'd call on me during lectures, then cut me off mid-answer to correct something tangential. She'd sigh heavily when I asked questions, like I was wasting everyone's time. Once, when I'd asked her to explain a concept I didn't understand, she'd said if I'd paid attention the first time, I wouldn't need her to repeat herself. Preston had asked the same question 10 minutes later, and she'd patiently walked him through it on the board. The other students noticed. Some looked uncomfortable. Most just absorbed the message that I was lesser, that treating me with contempt was acceptable because the teacher did it. I'd tried talking to my guidance counselor, Mr. Fenton, about switching classes. He'd looked at my schedule and said Mrs. Delacroix was the only AP chemistry teacher, that I'd have to drop to regular chemistry if I wanted out. That would tank my GPA and destroy my college applications. Schools wanted to see AP courses. I'd asked if there was anything he could do about her treatment of me. Mr. Fenton had gotten uncomfortable, saying teacher-student conflicts were complex, that maybe I was being too sensitive. He'd suggested I try harder to meet her expectations. I'd left his office, understanding that complaining about a tenured teacher while being a poor kid with no connections was pointless. The system protected people like Mrs. Delacroix. People like me were expendable. The breaking point came during a group project second semester. We'd been assigned to create a presentation on chemical reactions, and Mrs. Delacroix had chosen the groups herself. She'd put me with 3 of her favorite students, including Preston. I'd known immediately this was designed to humiliate me. The first group meeting, Preston had said he'd handle the presentation since he was good at public speaking. Sienna had said she'd do the research. The third student, a girl named Maya, had volunteered for the visual aids. That left me with nothing. I'd said I could help with any of those tasks. Preston had said they had it covered, that I should just show up for the presentation. I'd pushed back, saying I needed to contribute equally. Preston had rolled his eyes and said fine. I could put together the bibliography. The easiest, most meaningless task. The one that required the least thought. Presentation day arrived, and I'd done exactly what they'd asked, nothing more. I'd compiled the bibliography, printed copies for everyone, and sat in the back while Preston delivered the presentation he'd written. Mrs. Delacroix had praised their work, giving the group an A. Then she'd asked what my contribution had been. Preston had said I'd done the bibliography. Mrs. Delacroix had looked at me with barely concealed disgust. She'd said bibliography compilation was a minimal contribution, that I'd essentially coasted on my group's efforts. She'd given Preston, Sienna, and Maya each an A. She'd given me a C, saying I clearly hadn't pulled my weight. I'd tried to explain that I'd only been assigned the bibliography, that I'd offered to do more and been shut down. She'd said that sounded like an excuse, that motivated students found ways to contribute regardless of initial assignments. I'd left class that day feeling something darker than anger. Hopelessness, maybe. The realization that no matter what I did, Mrs. Delacroix would find a way to mark me as failing. My mom had noticed I'd stopped talking about chemistry class. She'd asked one evening if everything was okay. and I'd broken down. I'd told her about the grades, the public humiliation, the group project. My mom had gotten very quiet, that dangerous quiet that meant she was furious. She'd said she was going to the school to file a complaint. I'd begged her not to. We both knew what would happen. Mrs. Delacroix was respected, connected, the head of the science department. My mom was a housekeeper. Complaining would accomplish nothing except making me more of a target. My mom had wanted to fight anyway, but I'd convinced her to let it go. I had 1 year left before graduation. I could survive 1 more year. Senior year started with Mrs. Delacroix teaching AP Physics, the class I needed for engineering programs. I'd considered not taking it, but every college I was applying to wanted to see advanced sciences. I'd enrolled and prepared for another year of psychological warfare. First day of class, Mrs. Delacroix had given her usual speech about academic rigor and high expectations. Her eyes had landed on me when she'd talked about students who didn't belong in advanced courses. I'd stared back, refusing to look away. She'd smiled slightly, like she'd accepted a challenge. I'd realized then that last year hadn't satisfied her. She wanted to break me completely, to make me quit, so she could feel vindicated about her assessment of my worth. The attacks intensified immediately. She'd mark my tests harder than others, finding ambiguities in my answers that she marked wrong while accepting identical answers from her favorites. She'd assigned a major research project worth 30% of our grade, and she'd rejected my first 3 topic proposals without clear explanation. When I'd finally gotten a topic approved, she'd said my outline was inadequate and made me start over. Meanwhile, Preston's outline was nearly identical to mine, and she'd approved it immediately. I'd started documenting everything, keeping copies of my work and notes on how she graded different students. I didn't know what I'd do with the evidence, but I needed to prove I wasn't crazy, that this was real. The documentary evidence grew throughout the fall. I had copies of my tests next to Preston's tests, showing identical answers marked differently. I had emails where I'd asked for help and been dismissed, next to emails from other students showing patient, detailed responses from Mrs. Delacroix. I had grade distributions showing I consistently scored lower than classmates despite similar work quality. My guidance counselor had access to all of it. Mr. Fenton had looked through the evidence and admitted it was concerning, but he'd said proving discrimination was difficult. He'd said Mrs. Delacroix could argue that my work legitimately wasn't meeting standards, that her professional judgment deserved deference. He'd suggested I focus on my other classes, where I was doing well. I'd left his office understanding that nobody was going to help me. I was on my own. The college application essay became a battleground. Mrs. Delacroix had volunteered to review students' essays, offering feedback before submission. I'd written about my mom, about growing up watching her sacrifice everything for me, about understanding that worth wasn't determined by economic status. I'd been proud of that essay. It was honest and personal and showed resilience. Mrs. Delacroix had eviscerated it. She'd written that my essay was self-pitying and manipulative, that I was trying to leverage poverty for sympathy, that admissions officers would see through my attempt to exploit my mother's hardships. She'd suggested I write about something that demonstrated actual achievement, rather than circumstances beyond my control. The comments had felt deliberately cruel, designed to make me question whether my life experiences were worth sharing. I'd rewritten the essay to be what she wanted, bland and impersonal, discussing academic interests and career goals without mentioning anything real about my life. She'd given it a passing review and said it was much improved. I'd submitted the original essay to every college anyway. They rejected me for being authentic. So be it. But I wasn't going to let Mrs. Delacroix take my voice. The acceptances started arriving in February. State schools, technical institutes, places that offered financial aid for students like me. Not prestigious, but real opportunities. Mrs. Burr-C. Delacroix had seemed surprised when Mr. Fenton announced my acceptances during senior recognition day. She'd congratulated me in front of the class, her voice flat and insincere. I'd nodded and said nothing. Knowing her congratulations meant less than nothing. The accident happened on a Saturday in March. I'd been working at my uncle's shop, a place called Martinez Auto Repair on the industrial side of town. We'd been understaffed that day, my uncle dealing with a family emergency, leaving me to handle the shop alone. It was late afternoon, around 5 p.m., and I'd been finishing an oil change on a truck when I'd heard tires screaming outside. I'd looked up just in time to see a sedan lose control coming off the highway exit, swerving wildly before slamming into the concrete barrier. The car had spun out and flipped, rolling twice before landing upside down in the ditch beside our shop. Metal had crumpled like paper. Glass had exploded outward. The whole thing had taken maybe 5 seconds, but it played in my mind like slow motion. I dropped my tools and run outside, already pulling my phone out to call 911. The operator had answered, asking for details I'd barely processed. I'd given her the address, said there was an overturned vehicle, said I didn't know how many people were inside. She told me emergency services were on the way, told me not to approach the vehicle if there was smoke or fire. I'd already hung up. There was smoke, thin wisps coming from under the crumpled hood, and I could see someone moving inside. A kid, maybe 9 or 10 years old, hanging upside down from the driver's seat. The driver's seat. A child had been driving. The passenger side door was partially crushed but looked accessible. I'd run over and tried the handle, locked from the inside. The kid was screaming, high-pitched panic, thrashing against the seatbelt holding her upside down. Blood was running up her face from a gash on her scalp pooling in her hair. I'd banged on the window, telling her to unlock the door. She'd either couldn't hear me or didn't understand, just kept screaming. The smoke was getting thicker. I'd run back to the shop, grabbed a tire iron and sprinted back. The window had shattered on the second hit, safety glass fragmenting into chunks. I'd reached through and unlocked the door from the inside, yanking it open. The interior reeked of gasoline and something chemical I couldn't identify. The kid had focused on me then, her screaming turning into words. "Help me. Please help me, I can't get out!" Her voice was raw with terror. The seatbelt was jammed, the mechanism bent from the crash. I'd tried to release it, but the button wouldn't depress. The kid was crying now, saying her mom was going to kill her, that she'd just wanted to surprise her mom by picking up the dry cleaning. She'd taken the car without permission, had barely reached the pedals, had panicked when the car accelerated too fast on the exit ramp. She was wearing a backpack, bright pink with a name tag, Sophie Delacroix. My stomach had dropped. This was Mrs. Delacroix's daughter, the woman who'd tortured me for 2 years. Her kid was trapped in a car that smelled like it was seconds from exploding. I'd looked at Sophie's terrified face and known I didn't have a choice. I'd have pulled anyone out, but this felt cosmically fucked up. I'd climbed halfway into the car, wedging myself through the broken window, glass cutting through my shirt into my ribs. I'd used my pocket knife to saw through the seatbelt webbing, cutting as fast as I could while Sophie cried and the smoke got denser. The blade was dull, meant for cutting wire, and the seatbelt was thick. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely keep grip on the handle. Sophie had grabbed my arm, her small fingers digging in hard enough to bruise. She'd been saying please over and over, just please, please, please. The belt had finally given way, and Sophie had fallen into my arms. I'd pulled her toward the broken window, pushing her through first, then climbing out after her. We'd gotten maybe 20 feet away when I'd heard a whoosh and felt heat blast across my back. I'd thrown myself over Sophie, covering her body with mine as flames erupted from the engine compartment. The explosion had been smaller than in movies. No dramatic fireball, just a sudden rush of fire and heat that had singed the hair on the back of my neck. We'd lain there in the gravel for a few seconds, both of us shaking. Sophie had been sobbing into my chest, her whole body trembling. I'd sat up slowly, checking her over. The gash on her head was still bleeding, but head wounds always looked worse than they were. She had bruises forming on her arms and chest from the seatbelt, probably some cracked ribs. Her left wrist looked swollen, possibly sprained or broken, but she was alive, breathing, conscious. That was what mattered. The car behind us was fully engulfed now, black smoke billowing up into the early evening sky. If we'd been inside another 30 seconds, we'd have burned. The thought made my hands start shaking again. I'd heard sirens in the distance, getting closer. Sophie had looked up at me and asked if I was an angel. I'd laughed, despite everything, and said no, just a mechanic. She'd said her mom was going to be so mad. I'd said her mom was going to be glad she was alive. The ambulance had arrived 5 minutes later, followed by fire trucks and police. Paramedics had taken over, checking Sophie's vitals, stabilizing her neck, loading her onto a stretcher. She'd grabbed my hand when they'd tried to separate us, begging me not to leave her. One of the paramedics had asked if I was family. I'd said no, but Sophie had insisted I come with her. The paramedic had looked at my cut-up arms and the burn on my back and said I needed treatment anyway. I'd climbed into the ambulance, still holding Sophie's hand. She'd told me her mother's name then, her voice small, Vivienne Delacroix. She'd asked me to call her mom, to tell her what happened. I'd felt cold, despite the burn on my back. I'd said the paramedics would handle that her mom would meet us at the hospital. Sophie had nodded, trusting me completely. This kid who barely knew me trusted me more than her own teacher did. The hospital had taken us to the emergency room, separating us into different treatment bays. I'd given the intake nurse my mom's work number for medical consent since I was 17. They'd taken Sophie to another room, and I could hear her crying, calling for her mother. A nurse had come to my curtained area and said Sophie was asking for me, that I was the only person she knew and she was scared. I'd followed her to Sophie's bay, where they were cleaning the gash on her head. Sophie had reached for my hand immediately, squeezing hard. I'd stayed with her while they stitched her scalp, 7 neat sutures while she bit her lip trying not to cry. She'd asked me to tell her a story, anything to distract her. I'd told her about the first car I'd ever fixed, a beat-up Civic that wouldn't start. Turned out the battery cables were just corroded. Simple fix, but I'd felt like a genius when the engine turned over. Sophie had smiled, asked if I fixed cars for a living. I'd said sort of, that I worked at my uncle's shop while finishing high school. She'd said that was cool, that her mom always said boys who worked with their hands were impressive. Mrs. Delacroix had burst through the emergency room doors 20 minutes later. She'd been in her work clothes, slacks and a blouse, her hair coming loose from its usual neat bun. Her face had been white with panic, her eyes wild. She'd run to Sophie's bed and pulled her daughter into her arms, sobbing. She'd been checking Sophie over frantically, touching her face, her arms, her bandaged head, asking if she was okay over and over. Sophie had cried and said she was sorry, that she'd just wanted to help, that she didn't mean to crash. Mrs. Delacroix had said she didn't care about the car, didn't care about anything except Sophie was alive. They'd held each other, and I'd felt like an intruder. This was private, intimate, a mother's worst nightmare ending with her child safe. I'd stepped back trying to give them space. Then Sophie had said, "Mom, this is the guy who saved me. He pulled me out of the car before it exploded." Mrs. Delacroix had looked up, and her eyes had met mine. I'd watched her face cycle through recognition, confusion, disbelief, something else I couldn't name. The nurse had jumped in, explaining what had happened, how I'd cut Sophie out of her seatbelt and pulled her from the burning vehicle. Mrs. Delacroix had listened without interrupting, her arms still around her daughter. When the nurse finished, Mrs. Delacroix had stared at me for a long moment. I'd expected her to say something, thank you at minimum. Instead, she'd just nodded once, a quick acknowledgement, then turned back to Sophie. The dismissal was clear. I wasn't needed anymore. The doctor had come in then to discuss Sophie's injuries: concussion, cracked ribs, sprained wrist, laceration. She'd need to stay overnight for observation. Mrs. Delacroix had nodded, asking questions about recovery time and follow-up care. I'd stood there awkwardly, feeling invisible, despite having just saved her daughter's life. A different nurse had come to check my injuries. I'd let her clean and bandage the cuts on my arms and ribs, let her treat the burn on my back. She'd said I was lucky, that it could have been much worse. I'd said, yeah, lucky. She'd asked if I wanted to call someone to pick me up. I'd said no, that I'd take the bus home. I'd glanced at Mrs. Delacroix, wondering if she'd offer me a ride. She hadn't even looked up. I'd left the hospital feeling stranger than I'd felt in months. I'd saved a kid's life, risked my own life, and the kid's mother had treated me with the same contempt she showed in class. Maybe worse, because now gratitude should have trumped whatever prejudice she held. Apparently not. I'd walked to the bus stop, my arms throbbing, my back stinging, feeling utterly hollow. The universe had given me a chance to be a hero, and it hadn't changed anything. My mom had freaked out when I'd gotten home. She'd been at work when the hospital called, had taken a bus straight there only to find I'd already left. She'd come home panicked, finding me on the couch with bandaged arms. I'd told her everything, and she'd started crying. She'd said I was brave, that I'd saved that girl's life, that she was so proud of me. Then she'd gotten angry, saying Mrs. Delacroix should have thanked me properly, should have made sure I got home safely. I told her it didn't matter, that I hadn't done it for thanks. My mom had said it mattered very much, that gratitude was the least someone owed when you saved their child. I'd asked her to let it go. Mrs. Delacroix had been treating me like garbage for 2 years. I hadn't saved Sophie to change her mother's opinion of me. I'd done it because a kid was in danger and I could help. That was the only reason that mattered. School the following week was surreal. Word had spread about the accident. Sophie attended Riverside Academy's middle school, and everyone knew Mrs. Delacroix's daughter had stolen her mom's car and crashed it. What people didn't know was who'd pulled her out. I'd kept my arms covered with long sleeves despite warm weather, hiding the bandages. Mrs. Delacroix had missed the entire week of classes. A substitute had taken over AP Physics. Students speculated about how Sophie was doing, whether Mrs. Delacroix would press charges against her own daughter for taking the car. I'd sat in the back listening to classmates express concern for a teacher who'd made my life miserable. Nobody knew that I was the reason her daughter was alive. Nobody knew, and I wasn't going to tell them. Let Mrs. Delacroix explain if she wanted to. Let her acknowledge what I'd done. She wouldn't. Mrs. Delacroix returned the following week. She'd looked exhausted, like she hadn't slept. She'd thanked the class for their support, said Sophie was recovering well at home, then started teaching like nothing had happened. Her eyes had passed over me without recognition. No acknowledgement. No thank you. Nothing. I'd raised my hand during discussion, offering an answer to a question about momentum. She'd called on Preston instead. After class, I'd walked up to her desk to submit a lab report. She'd taken it without looking at me, adding it to a stack. I'd stood there, waiting. She'd finally looked up and asked if I needed something else. I'd said no, and left. The message was crystal clear. Saving her daughter hadn't changed anything. I was still the waste of space she'd named me. I was still beneath her notice. The rage built slowly over the next week. I'd saved a child's life. I'd risked myself pulling that kid from a burning car, and the mother couldn't even make eye contact. I started wondering if Mrs. Delacroix resented that I'd been the one to save Sophie, if she wished it had been someone else, someone worthy, someone from the right side of town, with the right family, the right future. The thought made me sick, but it explained everything. In her worldview, people like me weren't heroes. We were problems to be managed, failures to be tolerated. My heroism didn't fit her narrative about who I was, so she ignored it. I stopped doing work in her class. Not officially, I still showed up, but I stopped trying. I'd sit there and stare at her, watching her pretend I didn't exist. Other students noticed. Preston asked if I was okay. I'd told him to fuck off. The principal called me in 2 weeks after the accident. Principal Okafor had wanted to discuss my declining performance in AP Physics. I'd said I was doing fine in my other classes. She'd said Mrs. Delacroix was concerned about my recent behavior, that I seemed disengaged and hostile. I'd laughed. Hostile. That was rich. Principal Okafor had frowned and said this was serious, that I was jeopardizing my college applications with my senior year grades. I'd asked if Mrs. Delacroix had mentioned that I'd saved her daughter's life. Principal Okafor had paused, then said yes, she was aware, that Mrs. Delacroix was very grateful. I'd asked if that gratitude included basic acknowledgement. Principal Okafor had gotten uncomfortable, saying she didn't know what I meant. I'd laid it out. 2 years of contempt, public humiliation, discriminatory grading, then I save her kid, and nothing changes. Principal Okafor had said she'd look into it, but her tone suggested she wouldn't. I'd started skipping Mrs. Delacroix's class entirely, not every day, but often enough to make a point. I'd forge my mom's signature on absence notes, claiming doctor appointments. Mrs. Delacroix never questioned it. She seemed relieved not to have me there. My grades tanked to an F, my GPA dropping from 3.6 to 3.2. Mr. Fenton called me in to discuss my college applications. He'd said the schools that had accepted me were contingent on maintaining my GPA. An F in AP Physics could get my acceptances revoked. I'd asked what he expected me to do. He'd said attend class and do the work. I'd said I'd rather fail than spend another day being treated like garbage by someone whose daughter I'd saved. Mr. Fenton had gotten quiet, then said he'd see what he could do. 2 days later, I'd been transferred to regular physics with a different teacher. My transcript would show the drop to a lower-level course, but at least I'd pass. The new teacher, Mr. Ito, had been confused about why I'd transferred so late in the year. I'd said I'd had conflicts with the previous instructor. He'd accepted that without pushing. The work was easier, almost insultingly so, but at least I wasn't being actively destroyed. I'd caught up quickly, my grades rising to a B within weeks. Mr. Ito had commented that I clearly had aptitude for physics. I'd said I'd had a good foundation. He'd asked if I'd considered engineering programs. I'd said yeah, that I'd been accepted to a state school with a decent engineering department. He'd smiled and said I'd do well. It was the first time a teacher had expressed confidence in my abilities in 2 years. I'd almost forgotten what that felt like. Graduation came in May. I'd finished with a 3.2 GPA, lower than where I'd started, but good enough to keep my acceptances. During the ceremony, Mrs. Delacroix gave a speech as science department head. She talked about pursuing knowledge, overcoming obstacles, never letting setbacks define your potential. I'd sat in my cap and gown, watching her perform concern for students' futures, while knowing she'd actively tried to destroy mine. After the ceremony, families gathered for photos. My mom was there, crying, saying she was so proud. My uncle had shown up too, taking photos of me in my graduation gown. We didn't have extended family to celebrate with, but the 3 of us went to dinner at a cheap diner, and it felt good. My mom kept saying I'd done it despite everything. I'd said it was because of her, that she'd made it possible. Mrs. Delacroix had been nearby with Sophie, who'd looked fully recovered. Sophie had seen me and broken away from her mother, running over. She'd thrown her arms around me and said she'd wanted to thank me properly. She'd made me a card, construction paper covered in marker drawings of a car and 2 people. Inside, she'd written in careful handwriting, "Thank you for saving my life. You're my hero. Love, Sophie." She'd decorated it with stickers. I'd felt something crack in my chest. I'd hugged her back and said she was welcome, that I was glad she was okay. Sophie had said she'd told all her friends about the brave guy who'd rescued her. She'd said they all thought I was cool. I'd laughed despite myself, said she was pretty cool too. Mrs. Delacroix had approached then, hovering uncomfortably. She'd said she'd wanted to speak with me. I'd said there was nothing to talk about. She'd said she'd written a letter, had sent it to all 3 schools that had accepted me. She'd said she'd told them she'd underestimated me, that bias had compromised her judgment, that I deserved every opportunity. She'd also submitted a commendation to the school board about my actions during the accident. She'd recommended me for the Riverside Academy Community Hero Award, given annually to a graduate who embodied selflessness. The board had voted to grant it to me. The award came with a $5,000 scholarship. I'd stared at this woman who'd tormented me, who was now trying to rewrite history. I'd asked why. Mrs. Delacroix had looked at Sophie, then back at me. She'd said because Sophie had been right. I was a hero, and she'd been wrong about me from the beginning. She'd said she couldn't undo the damage, but she could try to make it right. She'd said watching me risk my life for a stranger's child had forced her to confront her own ugliness. For the first time, she'd seen herself clearly, and she'd been ashamed. I'd wanted to stay angry. I'd wanted to tell her to shove her scholarship and her letter. But Sophie was standing there, holding her mother's hand, looking between us, hopefully. This kid who'd made a stupid mistake and survived it. Maybe her mother deserved a second chance too. I'd said thank you for the letter and the scholarship. Mrs. Delacroix had nodded, eyes wet. She'd said she'd spend the rest of her career trying to be better, to see students clearly. She'd said I'd taught her something essential about worth. I'd said I hoped she meant it. She'd said she did. Sophie had hugged me one more time before they'd left. My mom had appeared beside me asking if I was okay. I'd said yeah, I was. I'm finishing my sophomore year at State Tech now, studying mechanical engineering. Turns out fixing cars was good preparation for understanding how things work. The letter Mrs. Delacroix wrote helped, her admission of bias providing context for my senior year grade drop. The scholarship money covered my textbooks. I still work at my uncle's shop on weekends to help my mom with bills, but college is manageable. Last week I got a message on social media from Sophie. She's 11 now, doing well. She'd sent me a photo of herself at a science fair, holding a first-place ribbon. Her project had been about vehicle safety engineering. She'd written that I'd inspired her to understand how cars work, so kids wouldn't get hurt like she almost did. I'd written back that she should be proud, that she was going to do important things. Mrs. Delacroix had commented too, thanking me again, asking about school. I'd told her about my major. She'd said it made perfect sense, that I had a gift for understanding complex systems. I'd accepted the compliment without responding. Some wounds heal, but scars remain. I don't hate Mrs. Delacroix anymore, but I'll never forget what she said about me, about boys like me not having the discipline for higher education. She was wrong, and every day I prove it. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.